Hi, everybody. We're just going to give it a minute or two here as folks are dialing in. So for those of you early folks, just sit tight. All right. I know some folks are still dialing in. I'm seeing the participant counter start to slow down a little bit. So we will get started as folks continue to join. Welcome, everyone. My name is Sarah Mason. I'm the Deputy Executive Director of Clean Energy for America. And I want to thank you all for being here for this discussion on clean energy and grid infrastructure. This is actually a, by request, continuation of an event we held on the same topic in June of 2022. So I know I'm looking forward to hearing what has or maybe hasn't changed in those last 2 years, what all we still have to do to get our power grid up and in the place it should be for the 21st century. And if you missed that last event, you should see a link in the chat. You can catch the recording of that. So if you want to compare and contrast how far we have come. All right. Before we begin, I just want to remind all of the attendees today that this discussion is off the record. It's intended for background and informational purposes only. However, if you are a member of the press and you are interested in being connected with any of our panelists today for either additional background conversations or on the record conversations, you can reach out to our comms team. That's just comms@ce4america.org, and we'll get you connected to them. Similarly, if you are a member of a congressional or administrative staff and you want to be connected to anyone to have policy-related discussions, you can reach out to myself. That's Sarah@ce4america.org, and I will direct you to the right person and make connections. Please also note that this event is being recorded, and the recording will be made available after the event on our website. So if you have to leave for part of it, you miss part of it, or if you've got a colleague that missed it, we'll make sure that that link goes around so everyone can check out the recording or just rewatch it. Throughout the webinar, please use the Q&A feature found at the bottom of the screen to submit any questions as we go. We will try to get to as many audience questions as possible at the end of the panel discussion, and we'll also do our best to follow up after the webinar on any unanswered questions. But of course, please do keep your questions, submissions germane to the topic at hand. We only have so much time. We can only cover so many things today. And please remember to be courteous to both the panelists and your fellow participants. All right. With all of that legalese out of the way, let's get started. I'm very excited to introduce our fantastic panel of experts today. So starting in no particular order, we have Rob Gramlich, the president of Grid Strategies, which is a DC-based consultancy focused on transmission and power markets. Rob is also the co-founder of Americans for a Clean Energy Grid, the Watt Coalition, Advancing Modern Power Lines, Macro Grid Initiative, and the Future Markets Power Forum, and probably a few more things that I missed in there. Very busy guy, so welcome, Rob. Happy to have you. We also have Michael Skelly, the co-founder and CEO of Grid United, an early-stage transmission development company. Michael previously founded Clean Line Energy, a company that successfully permitted some of the longest transmission lines in the U.S. He's now putting his talents to use in his adopted hometown of Houston, Texas, which a place that is no stranger to grid challenges. So we're excited to have you. Thanks, Michael. And next up, we have Max Luke. Max is the Director of Business Development and Regulatory Affairs at Veer, a venture-backed company developing the next generation of advanced conductor technologies. Max oversees Veer's commercial engagements with transmission utilities, generation developers, and large electricity consumers, as well as the company's strategic engagements with government and regulatory bodies worldwide. So welcome, Max. In moderating today's discussion, repeating his role from our last webinar, is James Hewett, the Senior Manager of Policy and Advocacy at Breakthrough Energy, where he leads the organization's work developing engagement and advocacy strategies for a number of power sector issues, including grid infrastructure and transmission, which is where the world that he comes from. So with that, I'm going to stop talking, and James, I'm going to turn it over to you to get us started.
Well, thank you, Sarah. I'm very lucky to be joined by two of my good friends and mentors here with Rob and Michael, and my good friend Max, who we talked to a lot since we invested in his company. So I'll disclose that right away. But turning it over, really grateful that we're getting the chance to run this back from where we started 2 years ago with this conversation on the Transmission 101 webinar. Rob, I think, is the person that coined the phrase that there's no transition without transmission. And so if we could put up a little slide here, I think it's helpful for showing exactly why this topic is so important to the energy transition. So I'm sure lots of folks on this call have seen this slide, but I think it's a helpful reminder of kind of where we're at in the transition. So if we are not going to increase the rate of transmission build out beyond business as usual, we more or less don't really see any reductions in emissions from both the bipartisan infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act. If we can substantially increase the amount of transmission to about 2 to 3% per year, what we're building right now, we could see kind of the largest reductions in an unconstrained IRA case. And so that's why transmission really is so crucial to the energy transition. So we're going to talk about a lot of different developments that have happened since we started this conversation 2 years ago, but I think it's important to ground us, why we're talking about this topic, why it's so crucial. And I know folks can more or less read through here. This is the Jesse Jenkins and repeat modeling that was done pretty closely after IRA was passed to show why this is so important. In terms of development since our last webinar, some of the things I think we'll get into today, there was some funding in both the bipartisan infrastructure law and IRA for transmission development. It wasn't as much as I think most people would have liked, at least the folks on this call, probably around $15 billion in total. FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, has passed a rulemaking on interconnection. They have several draft rules in development right now that we expect to be finalized very shortly, and I'm sure we'll talk about those today as well. DOE has done several things in terms of getting funding out the door, as well as developing rulemakings on siting and permitting that should be helpful. And then two other topics, I think there's a lot of interest recently, especially with the DOE liftoff reports and other reports that have come out around grid enhancing technologies and advanced conductors or high performance conductors, which we'll also get into. And then lastly, I think one of the more, controversial topics in this space around permitting reform and why it's so crucial for transmission, and I'm sure we'll get lots of questions about that. But I do want to make sure that we leave enough time at the end here to take some audience questions, so please start putting those in now. Happy to pepper those in throughout as well. But why don't I open it up with a question for each of our panelists, starting with Rob, and then we'll go to Skelly and then Max. What has changed since we had this conversation 2 years ago? What progress have you really seen because of the several laws that have been passed and the work that the admin has done to really advance transmission? And, maybe kind of what I hinted at earlier, how has transmission fared compared to other technologies like wind and solar or other renewable or non-renewable zero carbon technologies in terms of those pieces of legislation? So Rob, why don't I kick it over to you to start here?
Sure. Thanks, James and Sarah and the group here. Great to be with you and with Skelly and Max. I might start with a bit of a negative comment, which is we haven't really had action yet, despite all the talk and the great ideas and the work. And I do want to credit a lot of folks at FERC and Department of Energy and White House for the interest in transmission and the work trying to implement programs and the development of some new programs like the Transmission Facilitation Program and some of the GRIP funding mechanisms, et cetera. But as you mentioned, the dollars, you said 15 billion. I mean, a lot of that is for upgrading existing wires. So it's really a small fraction of that that's actually for new lines. So the problem is Congress barely appropriated anything for transmission. And there was, of course, famously a transmission tax credit that was in Build Back Better, but it didn't get all the way through in the Inflation Reduction Act. That's a whole story and saga unto itself. But the reality is, not many dollars actually got through. And, at FERC, we're very hopeful. There's a rulemaking that could be finalized. It looks like it will be finalized May 13th. But, thus far that's been a proposal, not a final action. And of course, a final FERC action needs to go through compliance and then the actual regional plan and then the actual development of those lines. So that's a pretty long way to actually delivering megawatts across long distances like we need. So I guess, a little bit of cautious optimism and appreciation for all of the excellent policy work happening at these different levels. And I should say some of the regions like MISO and California ISO are planning ambitious transmission plans. And certain utilities are showing some leadership on grid enhancing technologies or high performance conductors. So it's, it's a little spotty. It's not like nobody's doing anything. There are, some bright spots, but, overall, we really haven't seen the significant action. So, I mean, my recommendation is, to me, this issue of the grid needs to be now the top of the climate agenda, since it sort of got left at the station during the legislation of the last few years.
Skelly, how about you?
Right. So what's happened in the last 2 years? First of all, thank you for getting us all together. It is in a business that takes like a decade to unfold. It is good to have these 2-year check-ins. So hopefully we'll be talking again before then. Couple of things have happened. One is, I think, Rob's comments notwithstanding, there is a more nuanced and sophisticated understanding of the importance of transmission. People kind of get it thanks to the work of many of the folks on the call, and I'm sure the participants as well. So there's a greater awareness of why we need transmission. And that the other big development is, like, the low growth story is just so much stronger than we would have thought it would be 2 years ago. And that is leading to two things. One is this enhanced understanding of transmission, but also a little bit of backsliding on people's on renewable energy, even keeping up as a percentage of generation. I live in Texas. Felt like we were on track for roughly 50% carbon-free electricity by the end of next year. It doesn't feel like we're going to get there now because of load growth. If it weren't for load growth, we wouldn't. We would get there. But load growth that brings new money into the system and hopefully helps pay for some of this. And then on the DOE side of things, I mean, DOE, as we all know, has been asked to turn itself from a kind of an R&D type shop into a deployment organization. That takes a little while, but we are participants under the transmission facilitation program. We won one of those contracts. Excited about that, and we're also mixed up in some of the other initiatives around permitting and expediting permitting. And we're encouraged that it does feel like they're beginning to hit their stride, and we understand it's a lot of work to set these programs up, and the programs call for complicated legal arrangements between the government and private actors to protect the public interest and also to help move things forward. And we're reasonably happy. We got a TFP grant award in October, and we think we'll finish this contract. We'll have an announcement hopefully fairly soon, and that's encouraging. On the I'll leave FERC to Rob because he's the real expert on that. But fingers crossed there. And on the record at the RTO level is kind of spotty. So CAISO, super ambitious, really making stuff happen. Bonneville in the Northwest, not hearing much out of those folks. MISO, maybe, we'll see. They're not as ambitious as I think many of us think they ought to be. And then in SPP, their expansion ambitions, we think, will help, develop the case for grid-to-grid connections, which we're quite involved in. So a mixed record, but some encouraging things happening. But I think in general, like, I think most people would say, well, you know what? We're not moving as fast as we ought to, and that's probably true, not just in transmission, but in a lot of other areas. But it does feel like we're picking up steam.
Max, how about you?
Yeah, so there's Rob and Skelly did a great job of just summarizing some of those trends, and I'll start with the load growth story, which Skelly mentioned. I mean, AI and data centers, that's a new conversation in the last 2 years. I mean, it's not new, but it's picked up a tremendous amount of momentum in the last 2 years. That story just contributes to the need for more transmission, that initial chart that James showed. All of the other things, and to cue off Rob's point a bit, like the funding, the 15 billion through the two packages, and the other tweaks and the permitting and the FERC reforms, in my humble view, those are but small incremental changes that are not nearly sufficient if we're serious about hitting that curve that James showed. If we're actually serious about that, I mean, if you think about, and I'm a huge history buff, so I think about the history of this industry and how it picked up steam, and like transmission lines started as serving local needs. They grew, there was the ISO RTOs, there was utilities banding together. And now we're in this era where they need to grow even more. We need bigger, longer transmission lines. The industry and the institutional inertia behind it are not sufficient, are not adequate to get to where we need to get. So yes, there's been a lot of momentum in the last 2 years. Transmission has continued to become cooler in public discourse, which is great. More people are talking about it, but I gotta tell you, if we're gonna do this, we need a lot more. That's what I want to leave you with initially.
It's great. And so I think that, yeah, go ahead, Michael.
SunZia is under construction, 500-mile HVDC line, combined with the generation, et cetera, $11 billion project, biggest project ever, in the sort of renewable energy space, like not as big as Vogtle, but a huge project, and it's happening. And there's some bumps and grinds here and there, but they're getting through it. And I think we're learning a lot through that process. And hopefully that paves the way for other projects. I think it's increasing the supply chain's confidence in our ability to get some stuff going. And hopefully they'll do well with the project, and that will beget, further projects just like it.
Yeah, well, we're going to talk about some of these big interregional projects in a second, but I do think it's important, Rob, since you're on here and you've kind of coined the phrase, the 3 Ps for simplifying the transmission regulatory process. You've got planning, permitting, and paying. Could you talk about what the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission is doing, what its proposed rulemakings, and maybe pepper in some of the interconnection rule and how those are related, and why these rules are important? What would folks who are so lucky to not have to work on FERC policy, how should they understand what's going on there?
I'm sorry if you don't get to work on FERC policy. Give me a call. I'm happy to engage you. It's fun. Of course, a quick point first, James, if I may. Both Max and I made a comment about the dollars in these bills recently. And just to put that in perspective, we spend $30 billion a year on transmission already. That is almost entirely just for keeping the grid, operating and replacing old assets and for resilience. And again, a lot of that money was just to help do more of that. So, so maybe let's say 5 of that 15 is really for new capacity, like new delivery capacity. So again, that's 2 months worth of spending in the U.S. So again, agree with Skelly. There's some signs of recent hope and progress in the business, but that wasn't necessarily aided by any of this legislation. So we do need, sort of more policy support to make this all work. Turning to FERC, on your question. So the Chairman Willie Phillips has announced, and the Commission has announced May 13th to issue this transmission planning and cost allocation rule. It essentially requires all utilities in the country to be part of a regional process that would proactively plan long-term, like 20 years, for the future resource mix, take into account all the factors, including load and generation changes, and incorporate the various, hopefully, new technologies and configurations and DC and AC and various options to find the best sort of configuration and type of plan that maximizes benefits, net benefits to consumers. Some regions do things close to that. Again, MISO and CAISO are close. New York recently has been doing more of that. New England is getting started. So it's a little bit patchy around the country, but this would essentially be requiring that across the whole country. So I'm very hopeful that it will really be a big deal. We really need it for reliability and resilience, even if you just forget completely about renewable energy or climate issues. There's been all sorts of recent reports from more national security, energy security, and reliability type interests. Every time NERC, the Reliability Authority, talks about reliability, they mention the importance of building out the grid, particularly the long lines. Now, one thing it doesn't do is the interregional. You're probably going to want to probe that a little bit. This is more intra-regional, so it gets things started with the right methodology within regions, and hopefully with the right technologies and scenarios and other sort of planning methods. And then on cost allocation, I don't expect it to do a lot. What the proposed rule said was the law of the land is beneficiary pays, and here's a set of economic and reliability benefits, and so allocate costs according to those. Which really isn't surprising. It's not much of that part isn't much of a change, but the point is, if you plan a robust grid, then yeah, there will be more cost to allocate. The approach to allocating it will be, similar to past approaches, but there's going to be a lot more cost to allocate. But it's for the benefit of everybody, and you can look at the MISO studies of how each zone gets well over the benefits, doubling the costs assigned to them. So that exercise will be done by each region. They'll find the benefits and costs and maximize the net benefits for consumers. And then again, hopefully sometime in the future, do something similar with interregional. And you also mentioned the interconnection rule. I think that did some of the sort of obvious low-hanging fruit last summer in FERC Order 2023, but there's a lot more to do on the interconnection processes. But it's always worth noting, probably the main underlying barrier to the interconnection really is the grid capacity. So strengthening that connection between the planning part for the long-term infrastructure and then the short-term process part of the interconnection is really important.
Thanks, Rob. And I think that's the key point that I wanted to hit on there for folks to understand is even if you speed up the front end process, it is not going to help long term unless you really start building out the grid capacity. But you also hinted at kind of my next question here for Skelly is, the main area that the rule does not address are these big interregional transmission lines. Your new company and your old company were both building these big interregional transmission lines. Can you explain why they're so important? And how they're getting built absent policy support, and really what else you'd like to see in terms of policy to really help drive these types of projects?
So they're super important because if you the weather events, as Gramlich and other Gramlichism is that, I think there's a Gramlichism, the grid has to be bigger than the weather. Okay, so if you're dealing with extreme events, those are typically hundreds of miles wide. And if you span interconnects, then you can kind of outrun the extreme event, and resources from one region can share energy with another region, and that helps ensure reliability while bringing down costs. And then there's other, if you want to share capacity resources, then interregional lines are very helpful for that. And if you want to integrate lots of renewables, wind fronts, as it turns out, move from west to east, and that allows you to integrate more wind, and the sun, as you know, goes rises in the east and sets in the west, and that gives us 3 hours to sort of play with. We actually see that in West Texas, where the peak sunshine, the sun hangs in even after it's dark in Houston and loads are high. So big long distance lines and planning are very helpful to the whole process. So then your question is like, so that's why it's important. Your next question is, why is this so hard?
Why is it so hard? You're obviously trying to get these lines built, and then, what would you like to see the federal government or, regions or state governments be thinking about that, maybe they're not doing right now, and, why they should care about this?
Okay. I think the big reason why it's so hard is because it's new and we haven't done it before. And we don't have established mechanisms to do it. So that's, kind of a big obvious point. Second, as a practical, we don't plan the grid interregionally. There's no planning process. You can't go to FERC and say, hey, how about a connection from here to here? If you go to MISO or SPP and say, hey, I've got this new line that goes to this other region of the country, it's really great for your people. They don't really have a process to digest that. They live in all the RTOs, at least from an east-west perspective, live in a pre-Magellan world, okay, where you sort of go off the edge, coming from either direction. And so this is a new thing, and new things are, humans, we kind of often like things the way they are. So we don't plan for, even though I think there's a pretty clear understanding from all the academic studies, and just kind of like we never have to explain to anybody why these lines make sense. They're like, yeah, it's just hurry up, get through those lines quickly. We get it. And so then I think in terms of what can be done, like, first, do no harm. Unbelievably enough, some of the RTOs, like MISO, you go to MISO and say, hey, I'm going to take power out when you have too much, and I'm going to bring power in when you don't have enough. That's like good idea, right? They actually study you in the opposite way. They will study you as if you're injecting power when prices are negative and they don't need any power. Well, that's exactly when you're going to take power from MISO and you're going to send it somewhere else. So you're going to help with their challenges. And they should want us to do this, and they shouldn't put up obstacles to us building these projects. And so they should study us when they need power, we inject power, and that should be the sort of, so economics should figure in their calculations, as they would do with other transmission lines within the region, but they send us through a generation queue, which makes no sense. And so, first sort of do no harm, and then the RTOs, and they're not against this. They're not but they don't they're not thinking oh wait, we got this opportunity. This would be a great thing to have. What's going on in our world that we could help make this happen? Now they're busy and they only have so many hours in a day, just like everybody else. So, and it's hard for them to sort through okay, what's a real project, what's not a real project, and so on. So I'm somewhat sympathetic to their conundrum, and their members are often not clamoring for this because they also live in this sort of pre-Magellan world as well. So but there's not we don't have somebody saying, hey, let's get going here. And maybe if FERC had an interregional process that could help kind of people pay a little bit more attention to this challenge. In the meantime, we soldier ahead, and we think, we'll come up with sort of backdoor fixes, and we'll try to, we're just stubborn developers. So that's all we know how to do, is just bang our heads against this wall. So I don't mean to sound too discouraging, but there are, there's our theory of the case, by the way, is the way we're going to solve this stuff is not through like, some, with all due respect to you people in Washington, through some like high-minded colloquium. It's going to happen because pig-headed people are just like, okay, well, let's just like keep going and try to figure this thing out. That's how we'll figure it out. And you all are doing amazing work in sort of setting the background music for, hey, these are good ideas. We as a country should try to support them. So we appreciate that. And that's kind of our theory of the case.
Yeah. So even though you didn't say it, I heard you also support a minimum transfer capacity requirement there. So I'm gonna
a minimum transfer requirement would be like really good because it would acknowledge something that like everybody knows that we need it. Okay. And everybody knows that it makes a ton of sense. And so like, let's just get on with it and figure it out.
Yeah. And I don't care if FERC or Congress does it, it'd be great. But
yeah.
Changing the subject a little bit, because I know we're probably going to get a lot of questions here about both these topics in the chat. Max, over to you. Like recently, there's been several reports that have come out about both grid enhancing technologies and innovative wires or conductors that actually transmit electricity. Your company, Veer, is working on advanced conductors, which I think we're going to change the colloquial term here to high performance conductors, since they're so much more high performing than the existing ACSR cables that are used in towers right now. But I guess could you talk a little bit about why these technologies have not been deployed more widely? Obviously, your technology is a little bit more innovative. You can kind of give us the difference between these technologies. And then I want to kick it over to Rob, since he also helps lead the WANT Coalition, which works more on the grid enhancing technology side, which is getting more out of our existing wires. So Max, can you talk a little bit about advanced conductors here?
Yes. Before I do that, James, can I respond quickly on the some of the interregional themes?
Oh, for sure.
That's Skelly brought up. So I love giving this anecdote again because I'm a history buff, and so the Natural Gas Act of 1935, I believe it was, gave FERC authority to cite natural gas pipelines that carried natural gas and oil products from the Gulf of Mexico up to the load centers in the Northeast. And that was because at that time, and that same authority was not given to transmission developers, not because transmission developers would never need that, not because interregional transmission would never be needed, but just because it wasn't needed at the time. So the fact that we're struggling so much with interregional transmission capacity today is just it's an artifact. It's an artifact of history. And I think, I don't know, I find that really interesting. So I just wanted to say that. And now I want to turn to advanced conductors. Okay, so here's the thing: there's no silver bullet to this problem. There's no, the way that I view it and the way that Veer views it is that we need to throw everything against the wall and see what sticks. That includes all technologies, that we've got at our disposal, and innovation of those technologies. Push on those. Policy and regulatory innovation, business model innovation of the type that Skelly's company is doing, and support for all of that. So there are in the advanced conductors category and in the category of technologies that can support the increases in transfer capacity using existing infrastructure. As James said, we've got a few categories. We've got what are called grid enhancing technologies, which include things like power flow controls, dynamic line monitoring, topography optimization. These are things technologies that you can deploy that enable some degree of more transmission capacity on the grid. Super important, right? And then we've got sort of, whether we want to call them advanced conductors or high temperature, low sag conductors. These are composite core conductors that can increase the transfer capacity of the existing grid by a factor of 2 or 3, depending on the technology. These are lines that you can string on existing poles and towers. Also super important. Imagine that, a 2 to 3x increase in transfer capacity without needing to build a greenfield transmission corridor and go through all the siting and permitting that entails. And then there's Veer. We're developing superconductors, another class of conductors where you can get 5 times or more the transfer capacity compared to conventional conductors within an existing corridor on an existing easement. The reason that these things are so important is because we all know how difficult it is to build significant new transmission capacity in this country. And it's not getting easier. I mean, we see trends moving in both directions, right? We see all the positive trends we talked about. We also see communities and siting and permitting authorities getting more stringent about siting and permitting. We also see costs increasing in some cases. So we need these types of things to move forward.
Yeah, it's really helpful, Max. And so I think, you know, there's a really great New York Times story about a couple of reports that have been done a couple of weeks ago. Now really focusing on the conductors piece. I think the kind of lesser piece that doesn't get quite as much fanfare are the grid enhancing technologies. So Rob, maybe you could talk about those a little bit, and then why utilities in this country in particular haven't really deployed those in any scale.
Sure. Well, I just noticed Brad Plumer's actually listening here. So thanks, Brad, for that New York Times story. That was great. I appreciate the news from you and others on that, getting the word out on these opportunities. And it's exciting to see superconductors now in the mix because they can really deliver a lot of power. And especially if you just think about whatever city you might be in. I'm looking at Washington, D.C., and I don't envision a lot of new rights of way coming into major cities, but there are some corridors where we could plug through a lot more power with some of these technologies. On the grid enhancing technology front, that term is more reserved for the operational tools, like they're not new cables or towers or big assets. They're more how you operate the system. There was a little known provision of the Energy Policy Act of 2005. It's section 219B3 for the policy nerds out there. And it basically directed FERC to provide incentives for these types of operational technologies. Well, here we are 19 years later, FERC has still not implemented that, that provision. Interestingly, we got President Trump's first FERC chair, Kevin McIntyre, to look at that and say, oh, wait a minute, just out of good government, we need to implement that. So he started a docket actually, but sadly he passed away. And here we are still, whatever, 5 years later, 6, I don't know, since then, and we still don't have this. So there's an opportunity for FERC to provide either incentives or requirements for these technologies. The main ones include dynamic line rating. That's when, you know, if the wind is blowing or it's cold outside, you can deliver more power over a line without heating it up too much. Or topology optimization, which is a software, or advanced power flow control, which reroutes power physically from one path to another. Sometimes people include storage as transmission in this category, but these are all operational measures. And, you know, some people say, you look at the way utilities make money, typical investor-owned utilities, they make money on large capital investments within their footprint. And, you know, generally big capital investments within a footprint do get made. The large interregional lines like Skelly are doing, those are harder in that business model. And the operational things that are very cheap, like some of these grid enhancing technology deployments, cost a tiny fraction of a new line. They don't fit very well in that business model. So there is some leadership out there. If you want to put into your browser PPL DLR, the PPL did a dynamic line rating project that got an award from EEI. So kudos to PPL and EEI for that. But we'd love to see much wider deployment. I know DOE is trying to help with that with some of their grants. But I think we need some more systematic incentive changes from really from FERC probably to get wider deployment.
Yep. And I think that's probably also true for advanced conductors here, where, you know, part of it is the state regulatory environment where, you know, even if a utility wanted to build one of these things in order to optimize it, they probably couldn't build it over the 20-year time frame. So that's why these FERC rules are so important. I do have 2 more topics that I want to get to before we turn to the questions here, but I see a couple of them coming in and they relate to these topics. But Skelly, so as kind of the big developer on the call, there's a lot of discussion in DC right now about permitting reform. I guess you hear a lot of different arguments from different sides. As someone that's building these big interregional lines, how should clean energy advocates be thinking about this issue? And what would you like to see as kind of the outcome of these debates that are happening here?
Yeah, so I think that I'm not up to the minute on this, but it seems like the trade that might be in the offing is, do we hurry up, or not? I wouldn't say hurry up, because 7 years doesn't feel like a hurry, but like, do we put some time limits on NEPA, like 18 months or something like that, to get through NEPA processes? And do we change some of the other aspects of judicial review? And then in exchange for that, it sounds like there'd be like minimum transfer or interregional cost allocation for transmission lines. And so I think what you want to ask yourself, if what you're worried about is carbon, do you believe that if we have more pipes, that we will burn more fossil fuels? And is it sort of worth the trade-off? In my view, particularly with IRA, the marginal run cost of a renewable generator is 0 or less than 0. So if we have a grid in place, we're not going to run the fossil generators as often. We'll probably need them for some sort of backup, for some future. And so I think you can make a pretty good argument that says, well, if what you care about is carbon, then you should sort of look at sort of the big picture. Today's gas pipeline is pretty efficient. And how do we know this? We know this because if you look at and 360 some days a year, the price of Henry Hub gas at the Henry Hub versus elsewhere in the country, like, it's pretty similar across the country. That is not the case with electricity, and that's how you know that the infrastructure that goes with electricity is not nearly as efficient in terms of the markets and so on. So that's maybe a little obtuse for some of the audiences that people have to convince of this, but I do think it is helpful and instructive to sort of keep an eye on the price. Like, where do we want to be in 2050? Well, clearly we're going to need to have a lot more grid. We know with a lot more grid we can get the generation, and that will be the trick to getting to lower emissions.
Thanks, Kelly. And so maybe to tie it into my last question here, and I want Rob and Max to respond to that as well too on the permitting side. Rob, your firm did a report back in December of last year that showed the amount of load growth that's going to happen in the next 5 to 10 years here. And it's pretty significant, both from manufacturing, data center, and then general electrification. I think most folks on this call understand that to meet our carbon targets, we need to electrify most things in the economy. But it's really been catalyzed here in the last couple of years because of the investments from IRA and kind of the AI revolution. So how does that maybe impact some of the permitting debate here? And then Max, I'll have you add on here, because I think a lot of this is going to be about upgrading the existing grid to meet that near-term load. We can't build a lot of these big interregional lines in the next 2 to 3 years. And so we're going to have to do a lot of upgrades to meet that. But Rob, maybe you can tie those two together and then kick it over to Max, and then we'll turn it over to audience questions here.
Sure thing. Well, I do think it is a widely held policy position across the aisle, across parties and across states, that supporting economic growth is important. Whatever one's view of the pace needed to address climate change or integrate renewable energy, positions on that varies. But this grid is absolutely needed to support economic growth and jobs. And it turns out that legislation, including the CHIPS and Science Act, which calls for more superconductors, we're seeing tremendous investment there. Guess what? That operation uses a ton of electricity, and the data centers use a lot of electricity and AI is driving that more. Guess what? I think people from a national security standpoint, I think would prefer also that be within the U.S. or close to it. And other onshoring of manufacturing that has been encouraged of late. All of these things, and electric vehicles and heat pumps and electric heating, all of these things are more electricity. And that's all a good thing from a climate perspective. So, whatever one thinks about, again, climate policy issues, that certainly motivates a lot of Congress, but not all. This load growth dynamic is changing, I think, the conversation with a lot of policymakers, and hopefully leading to a positive outcome to help get some infrastructure built.
Great. I'll just cue right off of that. So, as a result of all of this electric load and electric infrastructure that's going to be built, one of the questions that is one of the key questions is, how much is this going to cost ratepayers? What are ratepayer bills going to look like going forward? I want to leave here with a slide, and I'm actually going to use this webinar as an opportunity to coin a term, so you can tell me how it lands. So on that idea of cost, what we're seeing in the data here is that it's getting more and more expensive to build transmission generally, but the gap between building transmission in existing corridors, the bottom piece there, and rather than building transmission in new corridors, greenfield transmission, that's widening. That's what we're seeing in the data. This is from a proprietary database that we subscribe to from the C3 group, which is also the database that FERC uses. I can't give you a really good sound answer for this trend or sort of reason why we're seeing this, but we're seeing it, and we've got some speculations about why this might be. And so the point here that I want to make, and the thought I want to leave everyone with here is, if we don't find ways to greatly increase transmission capacity in existing corridors, there is no pathway to net zero carbon emissions in the country that doesn't greatly increase costs for ratepayers associated with the need for transmission upgrades. And that's it. And I've coined this the greenfield gap, and I'll leave you with that.
Thanks, Max. So definitely appreciate everyone's thoughts here, and turn it over to questions. I will say, at least from my personal perspective, with this load growth issue, if we aren't able to get capacity expanded, I think a lot of these customers would prefer it to be zero marginal cost clean energy. But absent any kind of permitting changes, it's probably going to be a lot more gas, because that's what can get built right now. And I think that anecdotally is probably what's leading to a lot of those line increase costs too. When you're not spreading out the total cost of benefits here. But one of the questions that we've gotten from 3 or 4 different attendees, so I'll try to summarize these questions together here, is around the distribution grid and leveraging DERs and VPPs and other distributed assets to help meet this load growth demand, as well as clean energy growth that we're seeing. They've also cited Dr. Clack's modeling on this issue. I guess open to all of you, kind of how do you look at the role of DERs in meeting our clean energy targets, and why do you think how does that interact with the transmission build out that we need?
Well, I can start. I'm a fan of Chris Clack and Vibrant Clean Energy's work, and also of large-scale DER, distributed energy integration. That integration, if done well, certainly can help with an overall more efficient power system structure, especially things like making electric vehicle charging flexible and happen at the time of day that supports the grid rather than drains the grid at the wrong times. I will note that exact modeling from Clack about the role of DERs also found we still need just as much large-scale bulk power transmission, long-distance transmission. It didn't find at all one replaces the other. It found they complement each other, and we still need the bulk grid. So those of us who spend most of our time on the bulk grid and transmission work I think saw that and said, great, you go for it, so whoever, work on the DER stuff, but we got just as much work to do on the bulk transmission side here.
I think, so Rob, you're referring to the study available on your website that looks at high DER penetration in the Southeast versus some other alternatives and the grids.
Yeah, there was that. So Clark did one for the Institute for Local Self-Reliance. You Google that, you can find that specifically too.
Yeah, I will say that from my own research on this topic, DERs and VVPs and other tools are really helpful, especially for shaving peak load and being able to shave off those peaks. The one thing I think, coming back to Skelly's point for Rob's saying, which I think might be a Michael Goggins saying, the grid being bigger than the weather, you really do need to balance out the entirety of the grid. And most substations in this country don't really backflow, so they are great nodal solutions for trying to shave load within certain pockets of the grid, and they can be a very positive thing. But we do still need to build out, in most of the studies that I've seen, you still have to build out the same amount of transmission, kind of regardless of how much DERs you really do end up deploying long term.
Yeah, and this is a little tangential, but there are studies that look at the similar dynamics with storage technologies. There's one recent from MIT, Audun, Butterud, and others that basically the same conclusion. Complementary adds contributes to the problem, but you still need a lot of transmission.
Yep. One of the interesting questions we have in here, and maybe I'll kick it over to Rob and Skelly, is on supply chain issues and how much of those are factoring into grid build out constraints and maybe cost increases that we're seeing.
Yeah, this is a big issue, in our sector and in just about in many other sectors of the economy, that there are supply chain issues and costs are going up, and people are trying to, it means you got to plan not 2 years ahead, but 4 years ahead for certain purchases, or even longer if you're talking about HVDC equipment. So, hopefully, I think we're starting to see a little bit of response on the manufacturing side, particularly with some of the incentives in the IRA. So I don't know if the worst has passed, but we definitely have to get this sorted out.
Yeah, I would just add that it sure would be great if utilities and their regulators would do some advanced procurement for some of that electrical equipment, rather than waiting till like the generation projects are fully ready to connect. They know a lot of generations coming. They know retirements are happening. They know upgrades are needed. And we shouldn't wait sort of until the last minute when the specific project is booked. So hopefully regulators can work with their utilities to get some more advanced procurement, and also, some of these pieces of equipment are on global markets, and Europe is buying up a lot of it.
I was just say quickly that, James, there's this transformer crunch, and maybe this is more of a question than anything else. But I think some of us have been following the DOE efficiency standard for transformers, and I think part of that will be moving to a new type of steel, of which there is only one company in the United States, I believe it's one in the Carolinas, that produces that type of steel. Like, what are the implications of that on the transformer crunch?
It's not good. I will say DOE recently walked back their proposed rulemaking on using amorphous steel as a requirement for distribution transformers. And so, I think the industry is starting to really raise the alarm here. But moving to the next questions here, I mean, we have a couple questions, and one specifically from Brad here about what permitting measures would be most helpful for transmission. So I just dropped a chart into the chat here that I like to use. I think it's it's not 100% accurate, but it's probably the best representation I've seen of the overall transmission regulatory and permitting process. And it pretty clearly illustrates why it takes 10 years to get a project built. And so maybe open it up to you all, and I'll come back here. What do you think would be most helpful in terms of permitting reform, at least at the federal level, that's been discussed here.
So first, I think you need to put that in the Q&A so everybody can see it. I think the chat just goes to us.
Oh, I think Maureen just did it to everybody. Great.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a few permitting reforms, and as Skelly mentioned, there's also sort of related cost allocation and planning types of issues that are also being discussed as part of quote unquote permitting reform in the Senate Energy Committee, and things like the big wires minimum transfer. So that one's a really good idea that could be in legislation. The some version of what was in Manchin's bill earlier of a developer can go to FERC and say, here's how I meet the national interest criteria to be designated as national interest for permitting and cost allocation purposes. That's much more, just process wise, that's much more in line with how regulations usually operate for a regulated industry, as opposed to, again, something coming down from the ivory tower saying here are the best corridors in the world without having any idea of what's happening on the ground. So I kind of like that idea as a little bit more of a bottom-up industry sort of approach to the permitting and cost allocation. What else am I missing, Skelly, in the permitting discussions? I mean, there are some things, I mean, just on that national interest, there are big things and small things you could do, but certainly one thing that needs to be fixed is you have to go through NEPA when DOE designates a corridor, and then at FERC when FERC issues a permit. So double NEPA for the same line, which is absurd.
Skelly.
So on an encouraging note, it does feel like DOE via 216H is going to lead permitting of transmission lines. That will be helpful because when you have like a half dozen federal agencies you got to work with and none of them really care much about transmission, that's different from when you have six various agencies plus DOE, and DOE cares, and they can play an important role in sort of moving things along. Elsewhere on NEPA, it's the 7-year window to get sued is truly frightening. And it hasn't happened yet that somebody has to but it has happened in other sectors. And it'll kill a company if you're halfway through a transmission line that has your NEPA permits and all your approvals, and then somebody appeals it 3 years in and the project comes to a halt. That will have a decade-long chilling effect on investment in this industry, and that will happen. Like I'm pretty sure it almost happened a pattern, and it's going to happen for sure. If we build enough project, that'll happen for sure, and that will be a huge problem for our sector. So I'm really afraid of that. And what else could be done?
I would add that, on the kind of judicial reform, obviously the window is very important. I think when I think about this issue, having some sort of interregional requirement, having interregional cost allocation, both not the standard. It seems unlikely that FERC would take those on without kind of a congressional mandate to do that. Enhanced hiding authority, obviously support that. But when you look at that chart, every time one of these projects jumps from agency to agency, that's another potential lawsuit. And so I think that process, which DOE has started to kind of streamline in terms of the 216H rulemaking, is helpful, but I still think a lot of these interregional projects are going to be open to several different types of rounds of litigation. I would encourage folks on this call to go look at the Cardinal Hickory Creek project, which will help connect 160 renewable energy projects to the grid. It has been sued, I think, upwards of 12 to 15 times at different levels of government, usually every time it jumps an agency. And so that's kind of the poster child of what needs to change here. So back over to Sarah. I know we're at time here.
Yes, unfortunately, I'm sure we could keep this going for several more hours, but we only have an hour booked, and I'm sure all of our panelists and our attendees have other things to get accomplished today. But This will not be the last of this conversation. Like I said, this follow-up was by request, and so I'm sure we can fill another hour at a later date. So thank you all, to all of our panelists for participating today. Thanks to all of our attendees for joining. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to C4A and follow up. You will be getting a thank you email, so you'll have contact information to reach out, along with a link to the recording. If you want to watch this again, pass it along, whatever. And we are actually having our next webinar in our educational series in 2 weeks on May 8th. It's on job force development and workforce training. So we'll put that link in the chat for folks one more time if you want to RSVP to our next event. But otherwise, thank you all again, and have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.